Now, I used to suck at wide-angle photography until I committed myself to learning how to do it. And one of the biggest concepts that I had to learn was perspective distortion, how to use it, how to avoid it when you don't want it, and how it works particularly with ultra-wide angle lenses like this. And this is a Laowa 12mm f2.8, and you really are going to have to understand and know how to use perspective distortion to master the images coming out of this lens. Now, the lens is going to be available on a bunch of different lens mounts. There's autofocus versions, there are manual focus versions. So I'll put some links in the description down below to the best pricing I could find, as well as the list of different available lens mounts. Laowa sent this lens out to me at no cost to myself. This is not a paid or sponsored video, and they had no say in the making of the video. Now, perspective distortion happens when you have an ultra wide angle lens and you get a variation in distance between two objects in the frame. So if you've got something very close to the frame, it will look huge and surreal and disproportionately large compared to the things in the background. So this creates a crazy surreal image. At times it can look almost absurd and gimmicky, but understanding the way perspective distortion works, if you just keep all the things in your frame at a somewhat similar distance, it will look like a photo or an image taken with a standard lens. It almost doesn't even look like an ultra wide. So that is the key, understanding how perspective distortion works, and you can use it to create surreal, crazy looking images. You can use it to just create slightly more interesting looking images, or you can use it in a way that you just don't notice at all by keeping most of the things in the frame a similar distance away. And a 12mm f2.8 lens is definitely not the easiest lens to start with. I think if you're not used to shooting ultra wide, I would start at probably 20mm. I think that is a sweet spot, which gives you a nice wraparound image, allows you to use perspective distortion, but isn't too challenging. I think a 12mm f2.8 is for a little bit more of an advanced photographer. The one thing that this lens will do for you is when you're in situations like a busy city or a cathedral or some sort of wraparound environment where you're trying to demonstrate that environment around you, often you're sitting there and just looking around and you go, oh, this is so magnificent. And then you take a photo and it kind of looks like nothing. Ultra wide angle lenses like this kind of pull you into the scene. You feel like that environment is wrapping around you. And although you'll often hear people talk about 35mm or 50mm being what the human eye can see, when you take into account peripheral vision, the human eye is definitely seeing a wraparound image like you would take with one of these ultra-wide lenses. So one of the obvious uses for this is architecture and real estate and travel and historic buildings, because this is going to allow you to capture this immersive wraparound image that you just can't get with anything but an ultra-wide lens. And if you want an extreme wraparound image like a 12mm f2.8, you're not going to get a zoom lens that goes to 12mm in general. You're pretty much always going to have to buy a prime or fixed focal length lens like this. The other thing that a super wide lens like this is going to be good for is vlogging. Now, you got to be careful because you are going to get this crazy perspective distortion. And there are times where you can almost look surreal or cartoon character-ish in the frame if you frame it the wrong way. But what it definitely does, it does set the scene. It does allow someone to see you in a vlog or documenting your life, and you see this huge wraparound environment around you and behind you, because the ultra wide lens is going to get more of that surrounding scene and more of that background in. And because of that, ultra wide lenses are extremely popular for vlogging. I think 12mm is getting kind of on the extreme end, but I definitely see YouTubers and vloggers that are using these focal lengths, and they are getting a very interesting style out of their videos. The other obvious use for this lens is landscape photography. Now, not the kind of landscape photography that most people think of as soon as I say landscape, not a mountain off in the distance, not a big wide roaming plain. This is for landscape photography when you are in a wraparound environment. This could be in a cave, this could be in a canyon, this could be in a forest. The other times that a lens like this works well is when you have interesting foreground elements or interesting landscape elements that are very, very close to the lens. You can tilt the lens down, get those interesting foreground elements, and then get that background wrapping around it. But I do think for most people just starting out in landscape photography, this one's going to be quite challenging unless you are shooting in a wraparound environment like a forest or a cave or a canyon or something like that. Just looking at the lens itself, it looks very similar to Laowa's previously released 10mm f2.8. It is a beautifully well-built lens. It has this really interesting color that they're putting on their new lenses, and I kind of like it because you just know it is a Laowa product when you see that color. It has a metal lens hood, all metal body, has a nice well-dampened focus ring. The focus ring is interesting. It's not all round. It even has these little notches out of it. So the lens definitely has a very premium feel. It's got a polished metal lens mount, and it has a weather sealing gasket. It also has an autofocus manual focus switch. Now, when it comes to the lens mounts this is available on, it gets a little bit complicated because there's a number of different versions of the lens. So first of all, there is a 5-bladed aperture version. And in that version, the Sony mount is autofocus. The Nikon version is autofocus. The Canon RF and the L mount are manual focus. There is also a 14-bladed aperture version of the lens. Those are all manual focus, and it comes on Sony, Nikon, Canon RF, Nikon Z, and L mount. Now, the difference between them, the 5-bladed aperture version is going to get you probably a little bit less smooth bokeh. It's also going to get you very specific sun stars if you're shooting stop down into the sun or bright points of light, where the 14 aperture version should give you smoother out of focus areas and round specular highlights even when you stop it down. For me, if you're shooting Sony or Nikon, I would probably just get the autofocus version, which is what I've got here. The other thing I will mention on the autofocus version is you do get a little bit of aperture chatter when you are changing the aperture. Apparently that is normal. That's nothing unusual. I've seen other lenses. I've got Fuji lenses that I paid $1,000 for that have a little bit of aperture chatter, but just be aware if you notice that, it's just the way the lens works. Looking at the image quality and starting with distortion, you do have a very modest amount of barrel distortion. Now, this changes based on the distance you are from the subject. So the closer you are to the subject, you get a little bit more barrel distortion. As you get to infinity focus, it's actually relatively straight. So although they are calling it a Zero-D lens, there is the slightest amount of distortion, but nothing I would really worry about, and it's very easy to correct in Lightroom. One thing you will notice is extremely heavy vignette starting right from f2.8, and it's still noticeable even at f4 and f5.6, and even at f8 and f11, it never really goes away. So if you're worried about vignette, you are going to get a lot with this lens. Quite easy to correct in Lightroom, but it is heavy and it never really goes away. The chromatic aberration performance on the lens is excellent. Sometimes at the very corners you get a little bit shot at f2.8, but that goes away as you stop it down to f4. So in real world results, I didn't have any situation where I noticed chromatic aberration affecting the image, but at the corners at f2.8, you might notice a little bit in some situations. Looking at longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is a change in color cast in the out of focus areas before and after the plane of focus, at minimum focus distance at f2.8, you might notice a little, but overall it's really well controlled. I didn't notice any at normal shooting distances, and as you stopped it down, even at close focus distances, it went away, so nothing that affected any of my real world images. The flare performance on the lens is probably its single biggest weak point, and this thing flares like crazy. Now, I will say I went and shot with it in a whole bunch of situations and didn't really have any problem with the flare, but when I went looking for the flare, it was very, very strong, and in theory, it ruined the image. So I didn't find it ruining any of my real world results, but I can imagine that there will be cases where that will happen. So just be aware of it. I think you could even kind of shade it with your hand if you needed to, but flare is probably the single biggest weak point of the lens. The close-up image quality was absolutely excellent, and it is a fun thing to be able to get close with an ultra-wide angle lens like this because you get this crazy, surreal, otherworldly image. At times, you can make it almost cartoonish. And the image quality at f2.8 at minimum focus distance is okay. It's perfectly usable, but it is better as you stop it down. And f4 and f5.6, I found it to be excellent. So in general shooting, I would probably shoot at minimum focus distance starting at f4 or f5.6. I shot all of the real world images as well as the test charts on my Sony a7R5, which is a 60 megapixel sensor. And starting right from f2.8, it was very sharp in the center frame, absolutely usably sharp. As you stop it down to f4 and f5.6, it might get a hair sharper, but it's honestly hard to tell because it is so very sharp in the center frame from f2.8. As you stop it down and get to f11, diffraction starts to creep in and the image gets a little bit soft. Looking in the corners, f2.8 is also very sharp. Not quite as sharp as the center, but also quite sharp. At f4, it gets a little bit sharper, and at f5.6 and f8, it's near perfect. The one thing you will notice in the corners is the vignette. You do have heavy vignette throughout the entire range. I found the bokeh and background blur to be generally smooth and pleasing. I thought the out of focus areas looked nicely rendered and weren't distracting from whatever is sharp and focus in the frame. Now we are shooting with an ultra wide lens, and getting out of focus areas is not something that you do a lot of, but if you get close enough to your subject at minimum focus distance, you will get specular highlights, bokeh balls, and generally out of focus backgrounds. And when you do, they are nice and smooth and pleasing. If you're somebody who's interested in ultra-wide photography for landscape, for cities, for travel, for vlog, I really can't recommend this lens highly enough. And I think it is a more useful focal length than the 10mm f2.8 by Laowa. I would definitely pick this one over the 10mm. Now, if something like this is a little bit out of your price range, I've just thrown a video on screen now. That is 11 full frame lenses under $100. So if you just want something fun and different to experiment with, then check out that video.